What Are the Odds by Mike Lindell. From crack addict to CEO. Digital Hawk holds and owns no copyrights to the reading of this material is for educational purposes only. Chapter 44. Full Surrender. My airport speech ran at the top of every newscast in Minnesota. Okay, that's absolutely false. Despite that bank of television cameras rolling tape the whole time, the media completely ignored my speech. Maybe it was because I said their predictions were wrong, but I suspected that if I had bashed Donald Trump instead of supporting him, my speech would have been replayed on an endless loop. It probably would have gone national. On election night, Kendra and I attended the Trump watch party at the New York Hilton in Midtown Manhattan. It was standing room only as the election results slowly rolled in. Kevin McCullough had told me to watch the election results had told me to watch the returns from certain eastern states. Virginia, for example, which many experts said would go solidly blue. If that happened, Kevin said, it would probably be a good night for Hillary Clinton. As we watched the news media call the states for one candidate or the other, my confidence started to waver. What if he doesn't win? Because of what I'd learned about how politics affects our daily lives, the thought scared me, but I pushed it from my mind and my confidence swung back in the other direction. Then, when Virginia returns showed Donald Trump doing very well there, I knew it was the deviation I'd been waiting for. From my front row seat, I turned to the people sitting around me and said, he's going to win. When the media called Pennsylvania for Donald Trump, the Hilton ballroom erupted in cheers. People were hugging and high fiving all around us. Around 3 a.m., the room exploded again when the president elect and his family walked in. It was a moment for the history books, and I took a photo as they walked past. I was amazed at the level of energy in the room, despite the fact that people had been standing and waiting for many, many hours. After Mr. Trump made his victory speech, Kendra and I stayed, soaking in every last moment of this once in a lifetime event. It was around 5 a.m. when we got back to our hotel. Kendra had gone to her room, but I was too keyed up to sleep and used the TV remote to jump between the news stations that continue to provide election coverage. By 8 a.m., some of those stations were calling my cell, including media outlets from my home state and as far away as Australia. What did I think of Trump's victory? They wanted to know. I guess they had forgiven me for the Minnesota airport rally, where I had pointed at the news cameras and told the crowd, the media, were all wrong. A Minnesota television station invited me to appear on a news program the following Sunday. A few days later, I walked into the show's green room to find my counterpart, a college professor, who was also there to discuss the election results. He was very kind and polite, but also seemed a little rattled when I began talking about the results in terms of divine intervention. On the air, host Esme Esme Murphy asked me all kinds of questions, including this one. What would you say to people who are afraid now that Donald Trump has been elected? Just give it a chance, I said. God has his hands in this. Change is coming, and it's going to be good change. The change in my own life had definitely been good. During my strange journey, God had placed in my path people of faith, integrity, and generosity, people with a heart to help others. I began to understand what God might intend for the platform he had provided, and that the Lindell Foundation and our focus on helping people might be a vessel for that. Throughout 2016, I had asked myself what a guy like me, why a guy like me would be invited to participate in high profile, nationally watched events. Now I was beginning to think that maybe God had opened those doors in order to expand whatever good the Lindell Foundation might do. But as much as I believed God's hand was on my life, I knew something was missing. It was like I would get right up to the edge of fully surrendering my life to Him, but just couldn't quite hand over the wheel. I wanted what Kendra had, but didn't know how to get it. In fact, I didn't even know what it was. During my first year and a half with Kendra, I would assure her that I had been saved, born again, but she didn't believe it. I talked a good game, but she didn't see spiritual fruit in my life. I knew she was right because I saw with painful clarity the person I wasn't. Though free from my addictions, I still had fits of rage and often took my deep seated anger out on people who didn't deserve it, including Kendra. But she was incredibly patient with me. She wanted the best for me and knew exactly what that best was. At a November meeting of my foundation board, Larry Ross, the guy who got me the red eye seat from Vegas to Minneapolis and rushed me to airport, told me about a retreat he'd recently attended. It was called Operation Restored Warrior, ORW, and was run by a man named Paul Lavelle, a former Army medic and a former atheist. I'd actually met Paul at the National Prayer Breakfast in 2016. His ministry has helped hundreds of men, most of them special forces and special operations, come to a place of freedom by locating primary points of pain in their pasts and inviting God in to heal them. Larry had attended an Operation Restored Warrior drop zone event. Even after 30 years working alongside Billy Graham, Larry said the drop zone really enriched his relationship with Jesus. I think it would be a good idea for you to go, he told me. My first instinct was rebellion. Though I knew something was missing in my spiritual life, I didn't like the idea that others might think so too. Was something wrong with me? Was I broken? After the board meeting, Larry pulled me aside and shared more about his Operation Restored Warrior experience. Not many civilians got to attend, so he felt very blessed to be invited, he said. As it turned out, Paul and his team had been praying since our National Prayer Breakfast encounter, had felt led to invite me to, and had felt led to invite me to. Larry had already spoken with Kendra about it, and she was very excited. But I felt conflicted. On it seemed another God-given opportunity. On the other, meant spending 5 days in the mountains with perfect strangers. Reluctantly, I said I'd go if a space opened up, but when one did, the very next month, I turned it down. I had a good excuse. In fact, it was a great excuse. Along with Larry Ross, I had been invited to the Philippines to discuss matters related to the Lindell Foundation. There was even the possibility of meeting Philippine President Rodrigo Huerte. But it was still an excuse, and Kendra wasn't happy about it. She insisted we get Paul Lavelle on the phone to reschedule. He found another opening and put me on his calendar. I was to travel to Lake Tahoe for a drop zone event in February 2017. In December 2016, I traveled to the Philippines and got to meet President Duerte. 2 months later, on February 16, I got a plane to meet Jesus, or at least I hoped I would meet him. I had thought I'd still be reluctant to attend the drop zone, but now I found myself filled with hope because of a man named Dr. Barry Black. I had just attended the 2017 National Prayer Breakfast, where I had heard Dr. Black, chaplain of the United States Senate, give a powerful, jaw dropping message. The whole time, I felt he was talking directly to me. After two catastrophic events that happened between the Philippines and the drop zone, his message refreshed me with optimism. As my plane touched down at the Reno Tahoe airport, I received a text from my assistant, Mike. Paul just told me there are a couple of other drop zone guys at the airport right now. They've offered to drive you up to the lodge. That way you don't have to get a rental car. It was an hour-long drive to the lodge where Operation Restored Warrior was holding the event. Absolutely not, I texted my assistant. I'm not riding with anybody I don't know. It was sad, really. Here I was 55 years old and still afraid of strangers. Get me a rental car, I texted. When my phone chimed again in my hand, I expected it to be my assistant giving a thumbs up. Instead, it was a new text. Hi, I'm Jason. Paul Lavelle gave me your number. We're headed up to Drop Zone and heard you need a ride. We'll meet you by baggage claim. Crap. The next thing I knew, here come two guys, both obviously ex-military, one of them walking with a cane. They introduced themselves as Jason and Tim. Hey, how you doing? And all that. Jason, who looked rock hard even in his 40s, took the lead, and the conversation went something like this. Jason, ride up with us. No sense in you driving up alone. Me, no, that's okay. I've got some work to do. I have to make some calls. Jason, won't bother us at all. Me, well, I wasn't planning on leaving for another hour. Jason, not a problem. We'll wait. Ugh, these guys weren't taking no for an answer. I really did have calls to make, but after an hour, they were still waiting. Resigned, I followed them out to their car, but no small talk I've had. As we started down the road, I stared out the window, making it very apparent that I wasn't interested in conversation. They probably thought I was a jerk when really I was just paralyzed, but it was more than the fact that I was uncomfortable with strangers. I had other things on my mind, serious things. The catastrophes I mentioned earlier had begun on January 2nd, 2017. I had just completed a 24-hour stint on a Canadian shopping channel that had broken all kinds of records. As I walked out of the last airing and turned my phone back on, it went crazy, buzzing and dinging with messages and notifications. I checked a few of them and found terrible news. The Better Business Bureau had dropped My Pillow's rating from an A plus to an F. Not only that, but they'd done a press release about it. I was in complete disbelief. We'd sold over 25 million pillows by then, but and the Better Business Bureau had received only about 230 complaints, or less than 0.001% of sales. I'd solved most of those personally, just as I had when I drove all over Iowa delivering pillows. As far as I knew, nothing had changed. Now I had three urgent questions. One, why in the world would the Better Business Bureau trash our rating? Two, why would they do so without contacting me for a resolution? And three, since when did the Better Business Bureau issue press releases about a business's rating? As I gathered my thoughts, I scrambled to the airport while making calls. I learned that the Better Business Bureau had tanked our rating because My Pillow's buy one get one free ad had been running longer than they thought was appropriate. So with customer satisfaction of literally 99.9%, the Better Business Bureau had rated My Pillow an F, then announced it to the media who were turning it into national news. The thought crossed my mind that it was a political hit job designed to destroy my company's reputation, and I couldn't dismiss that idea. To fight back, my publicist arranged for reporters to visit my Shakopee factory. Outlet after outlet set up in different offices, and when I got back from Canada, I circulated among them, answering the charges in the Better Business Bureau's press release. The media were stern and skeptical, customers as though my offering customers two pillows for the price of one were some heinous breach of business ethics. Suddenly, I felt like a fugitive again, the way I had after the 1983 gas station incident. Back then, I had destroyed my own reputation. Now, someone else was destroying it for me. Unbelievably, the media requests went on and on. Days into the deluge, I was feeling discouraged and beaten down when my sister Marcy called with even more bad news. Her dad had been admitted to the hospital. Marcy ran down the symptoms using medical terms that seemed natural to her because she's a nurse, but made no sense at all to me. I rushed to the hospital, calling my sister Robin on the way. Robin always sees the sunny side of things, and when she told me she could hardly stand to see our dad like this, I knew it was bad. When I arrived in Dad's hospital room, he didn't even recognize me. He was talking to himself, sputtering as he spoke, unable to form full words. One second he was gripped in extreme agitation. The next, he would lapse into a blank stare that reminded me of a movie. I'd seen where a man gets a lobotomy. Seeing my father this way, I just about lost it and dashed into the hall screaming for a doctor. Eventually, the doctors told us they believed there was only a 5% chance that my dad would ever come out of this state. When one said we should start looking for a nursing home to put him in, tears welled in my eyes. Are you okay? The voice that interrupted my thoughts came from the front seat of the rental car, and I realized that the two guys from the Tahoe Airport had already navigated far up into the mountains. Yes, I said. I quickly shook off my reflective state and began engaging with them a bit, asking questions. I learned that both were military veterans. They neither had attended a drop zone before, and that, like me, they weren't sure what to expect. We were all in the same boat. The one who used a cane shared some thoughts he'd seen in Iraq, things I couldn't even imagine. He was wounded in action, he said. After listening to their stories, I dropped my defenses and found myself opening up. By the time we reached the lake, I decided that in spite of my resistance, riding with these guys had been another divine appointment. Instead of arriving at the drop zone with perfect strangers, I felt like I was arriving with friends. When we arrived at the lodge, it felt like we had driven straight into a Christmas card. Snow covered grounds led off into the woods in every direction. A ring of white capped mountains surrounded the crystal blue lake. Inside, I put my bags in one of the many guest rooms and joined the rest of the attendees downstairs for a meet and greet. My nerves ramped up again as I realized I was in a round of three things I wasn't a fan of: small talk, rules, and expectations. On top of that, I discovered that all of the other men were veterans. I had had brushes with death myself, guns pointed at me, that machete held to my throat. But that paled in comparison to what these guys had been through. I could tell they were some of the toughest men in America. Intimidating? Absolutely. As soon as I could, I retreated to my room and stayed there. As I lay in bed that night wondering why I had come, I remembered a conversation I'd had in May 2015 with a pastor who along the way helped me with this book. By that time, I had a long manuscript that was really not a book, but more of a collection of stories. I had separated the manuscript into individual stories and lined them up in little stacks on a long table. My problem is, I don't know what to leave in and what to leave out, I told the pastor. By then, He had read many of the stories you've now read. Suddenly, he grabbed a random pile of paper from somewhere in the middle and waved it at me. You could take any one of these things that happened to you, and any normal person would have surrendered to God right there on the spot. Then he gave me a long, penetrating look. Mike, God's been chasing you this whole time. Maybe all these things happened to you to get you to Jesus. How much more does he need to do to prove to you he is real, that he's real? I realize now the pastor was right, and he didn't even know about the incredible events of the past 2 years. How many one in a million, one in a billion events did I need? As I fell asleep that first night in Tahoe, my hope returned. The next morning, I woke up early and went downstairs. Paul Lavelle walked up and greeted me. Mike, I've got two things to ask you, he said. Number one, will you commit to staying off your phone? I know it's glued to your hand and you need it to run your business, but it's really important that you stay off of it here. I already knew about this requirement, and it had been one of the big reasons I didn't want to come. I ran my entire business off my phone. Paul looked at me, waiting for an answer. Yes? I said. Okay, yes. Number two, do you know this guy? Paul reached out and touched my cross. I was wearing it outside my collar, like always. Yes, I said again, knowing he meant Jesus. I mean, I know him about as well as anybody could know him. Could know him. Here's a promise, Paul said. If you will open up your heart while you're here, you're going to be in a completely different place when you leave. Fairly quickly, I began to see what he meant. Throughout that day, I found myself slowly letting my guard down. Paul encouraged us all to share our stories. He had had heads of state come through Operation Restoration Warrior. He'd listened to generals, priests, and PhDs. Every story matters, he said. The power of one person's story does not diminish the power and authority of another person's story. I realized that the group conversations and sharing reminded me of those I'd attended nearly a decade ago at Living Free. It wasn't about your lowest points in life, how many drugs you'd done, who you were, or where you'd been. It's that everyone has emotional wounds and trauma, and that for many people, those wounds leave debilitating scars. Back in my room that night, with time to reflect, I realized that for most of my life, I had been playing chicken with God. Each time I faced a one on a million or one in a billion circumstance, each time I'd wondered, how am I going to get out of this one? I somehow always did. That gave me the illusion of control and caused me to keep testing the limits. Now I knew that God hadn't protected me in all those moments for nothing. The platform he had provided was real, and as Kendra had told me many times, how was I going to convince anyone of anything if I hadn't been truly redeemed myself? That night, I resolved to hand over the wheel. I would no longer be the driver of my own life. A couple of days in, we each had to write down the major experiences in our lives, our core memories, or primary points of pain, just as we had at Living Free. Paul compared these memories to a spider web that sends out poison silk into every area of our lives. We don't get through life without taking hits, Paul said. You have to go back and address these broken places. The next afternoon, I sat in a room alone with a facilitator and did exactly that. The facilitator asked me to close my eyes and take myself back to those pivotal moments in my life when my heart and spirit were wounded. I was 5 years old again. Then I was 7, then 10, then a teenager, then an adult. It was like watching the first movie of my life all over again, that first reel in the double feature. With the facilitator's guidance, I didn't just relive events, I was there. I couldn't see everything. I could see everything. I could smell and taste and feel. The pain of my past swelled like a river overflowing its banks, and deep, having so- heaving sobs broke from my chest. It was only then I realized I'd spent more than 50 years holding it all in. "Can you look around?" the facilitator said softly. "Yes," I said. In the eye of my spirit, I did look around. "Is there anyone there with you?" Yes, I could see him. Jesus was with me. And suddenly I knew he had been with me through it all. I knew he had been with me through my parents' divorce. He had been with me when I rolled through the fire and the time I almost died when I wrecked Fred's truck. Jesus had been with me when I made terrible, terrible mistakes. Jesus was with me in the casino bars, the crack houses. He was with me when Karen left me and when I left my kids alone. He was with me when I won fortunes, when I foolishly lost them. Jesus had been there the whole time, chasing me, running after me the way a father pursues a lost son. I had buried the pain deep, but all my life it had punched through to the surface, like weeds breaking through concrete. I couldn't talk to people, not because I didn't like talking, but because I didn't feel like I was good enough. I felt different, ignored, unworthy. That spirit of unworthiness hung over my entire life like a cloud, and I spent all my time trying to claw through to the clear, clean sky. All my death defying stunts. This was 7-year-old Mike, waving his arms, yelling at the world, "Hey, I'm here. I am here." And when that didn't work, I started to medicate the pain. First gambling, then alcohol, then cocaine and crack. And even amid all that, God kept trying to get my attention. Many times I had prayed the prayer of salvation, asking Jesus to come into my life, but now I had been with him and I prayed with a passion I had never known. Right there in that living room in Lake Tahoe, I surrendered. The sense of a release I felt was overwhelming. As I prayed, I felt myself letting go of all the guilt for things I'd done in the past, even that shameful moment at the gas station when I'd broken my own moral code and embarrassed my family. What replaced the guilt was an incredible mixture of joy, love, and peace. So many times before I'd glimpsed this moment, I'd felt God holding out his hand, but I was ready to relinquish control. Now, finally, I turned it all over to God. All my sins fell away like a heavy burden I didn't have to carry anymore. I trusted him completely and had complete faith that he would guide my path. It had taken 55 years, but God finally caught me. I had finally given up my seat behind the wheel. 5 days after I got there, I left Lake Tahoe, but I never came down from that mountain. The next time I spoke with Kendra, she was overjoyed. Even over the telephone, she could tell I had been changed. It had all become clear, all those calls, all the impossible coincidences, all the times I asked myself, what are the odds? That was Jesus waving his arm and saying, I am here. Epilogue. When I walked out on the stage, all I had was a mic in my hand. There was a podium, but I didn't stand behind it. I had prepared some notes to speak from, but I didn't use them. Without any shield or crutch, I was able to, for the very first time, stand on a stage without fear and deliver a message of hope. It was August 21st, 2019. The venue was Liberty University's Vine Center, a deep amphitheater with rows and rows of seats stretching up toward the rafters. The event was the university's weekly convocation, with more than 13,000 in attendance and thousands more watching on TV and online. It is North America's largest gathering of Christian students. Past speakers have come from diverse viewpoints and all walks of life, from preachers to presidents and everything in between. As I stood on that same stage and as and was welcomed by an incredibly gracious crowd, it was a humbling experience. When I opened my mouth and began to speak, all I did was tell my story. I've come to understand this as my calling, telling about a life spent running from and then running to the God of second and third and fourth chances. It is a story of a God who is in the business of redeeming sin and failure and with love and grace. My own history of proof that none of us should ever give up on our dreams, and that with God all things are possible. My goal is to spend the rest of my life telling people about His awesome redeeming power. One of the first people to encourage me to be public about my faith was Don Imus. First time I appeared on his television show and started talking about God, Imus said, "Now, don't get crazy on us, Lindell. Now, don't get crazy on us, Lindell." For years after that, whenever I appeared on his show, I would leave God out. During my final appearance, he asked me to retell the My Pillow story. I got to the part about our first failed mail kiosk when we sold only a few pillows. It was the time that guy asked for my number in case he wanted his money back. Then turned out to be an organizer for the Minneapolis Home and Garden Show. I was sharing how that phone call had been key to launching my company when Imus interrupted me. "Why do you think that guy called you?" he said. "Because he liked the pillow?" I said hesitantly. I knew Imus didn't want me talking about God, but he kept asking me over and over, "No, Mike, why do you think that guy called you?" Finally, I said, "Well, if you want the truth, it was a divine appointment." "No, I want you to lie to me," Imus snapped, scolding me on national television. "Of course I want the truth. You have to be ashamed of talking about you don't have to be ashamed of talking about the baby Jesus. There's a big calling on your life. Don't you ever back down." Imus is one of the people who helped me along the way, from hundreds of new friends to perfect strangers who reached out when I didn't have the courage. So many people have made a major impact on my life and work. That was especially true in the case of my ongoing battle with the Better Business Bureau. Remember when the Better Business Bureau dropped My Pillow's rating from an A plus to an F? Following the group's January 3rd, 2017 press release, the media attacked and the onslaught did not let up. Then, on January 11th, Bloomberg News published an article called "The Preposterous Success Story of America's Pillow King." Bloomberg had been working on the story for months, and it was a godsend. Not only was it our first major national feature, but it had really changed the narrative. When people all over the world read the article, which was basically a brief version of the story in this book, they launched a counteroffensive on social media and on the Business Bureau website itself. In fact, so many My Pillow supporters bombarded the Better Business Bureau that one of their executives eventually had to go on the TV and endure a reporter's questions about why the organization had slashed our rating from an A plus to an F instead of, for example, a B or a C. The whole incident, which seemed designed to destroy My Pillow, instead raised our profile exponentially. Our sales actually increased, and more importantly, our platform for doing good gained enormous visibility. Believe it or not, MyPillow's Better Business Bureau rating is still an F today. I would like to tell people that an F stands for fantastic. On the heels of the Better Business Bureau episode, in July 2017, I was invited to the White House for a manufacturing summit. I had visited historic places in Washington, D.C., but never 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. So when I arrived at the famous address, I was excited as a kid on a junior high field trip. After jumping through all the security hoops, I walked into the conference room and found the nameplate that indicated my seat. The seat next to me didn't have a nameplate. I got the attention of some official looking person and asked, "Who's sitting there?" "The president," he said. During the meeting, reporters positioned themselves around the room, snapping photos, cameras rolling. The next thing I knew, there were stills and videos plastered all over the news. I started getting texts from my addict friends back home along the lines of, "Wow, Mike, from crack house to the White House." Most importantly, this crazy circumstance also prompted some serious reflection. People later told me that's impossible. These friends thought Michael Lindell, an ex crack addict from Minnesota, is sitting next to the President of the United States. Jesus must be real. Several of them got sober after that, and I'm not kidding. They had witnessed so many of the improbable things that had happened to me, including my sobriety. Vic Dunslan had been my hope match, and now I became theirs. As I progressed in my recovery, I developed a passion for connecting addicts with effective recovery programs on a large scale and for helping them rebuild their lives. And how do addicts rebuild? We benefit from the right rehab, yes, but we rebuild by having our hearts restored. Not only do we need to be set free from physical addictions, but from emotional wounds and trauma, which often occur in childhood. That's all it is. It's that simple. The Lindell Recovery Network, in development for the past 2 years, will do just that. Through a series of divine connections, God has helped me create a unique plan that will offer addicts the most powerful help available anywhere and on an unprecedented scale. And because of Donald and Melania's Trump passion for wiping out addiction, the Trump administration is also eliminating many of the bureaucratic roadblocks that prevent help from reaching the people who need it. With God's help, my goal is to help millions of addicts and to help thousands of jobs, create thousands of jobs. I can hardly believe God has put me in a position to put this plan into action. 2 months after the manufacturing summit in September 2017, My Pillow entered a float in the annual Steamboat Days parade in Carver, Minnesota. Visiting Carver was very meaningful for me. I'd spent more than two-thirds of my life in the town, and so much had happened here. So many bad decisions, but some good ones too. So many wrong turns, but also some right ones. Now I was going to ride this parade float and toss out my pillows to kids along the route. I was already aboard and ready to go when a police cruiser pulled up next to us and stopped. The car opened and a uniform got out. It was Officer Larry. This this is the epilogue. Chapter 44 was read. Most of us 43. Page 324. I laughed. Just like the old days, isn't it, Larry? You pulling me over, Larry? Was the Carver police officer who's. I laughed. Just like the old days, isn't it, Larry? You pulling me over. Larry was a Carver police officer who pulled me over on a warrant. But then let me get those important papers to Corey instead of arresting. Let me get those important papers to Corey instead of arresting me instantly. I jumped off the float and we caught up for a few moments. Hey, am I in that book you're writing? Larry said. You sure are. Do you remember what I said back to you back then? I told Larry I knew he had an arrest warrant for me, but that I had to get those papers to Corey. My pillow was finished, or my pillow to Corey. My pillow was finished. That the platform, which had something to do with God, would be gone. That it would change history. Of course I remember, Larry said. Why did you believe me, Larry? It was a question I'd wondered about for years. Larry said, Mike, You were so passionate. I just believed that you believed what you were saying, bottom line. Like so many others, he took a chance on me and probably changed the course of my life. Larry and I said our goodbyes. I climbed back onto the float and the parade began. Riding through Carver felt like a homecoming. As I tossed out pillows to kids along the route, I saw so many familiar faces, people I'd grown up with, some regulars from Schmitty's, city leaders, old friends, and new ones. It was like a rewind of all the seasons of my life, and I thought I could see it in their faces that they had forgiven me. Finally, I had forgiven myself. Kendra has taught me so much about forgiveness, about grace and redemption. As we navigate life together, we continue to grow closer, building our relationship with God as our firm foundation. Along the way, many people ushered me toward Jesus, but she is the one who led me home. Since our first meeting, she has stood by me and behind me with love and prayer. Maybe more than anything, prayer is the thing in my newfound relationship with Jesus has impacted most. It was January 2017 when I found out my dad was in the hospital, trapped in the nightmare of delirium. Doctors said he would never escape. Dad spent the next 7 months in three different hospitals. During that time, my siblings and I never gave up. Marcy spent almost every day next to his bed, while the rest of us prayed fervently for his recovery. People Before I met Jesus, I was reactive in prayer, asking God to get me out of one scrape or another. But after the drop zone, I became proactive in prayer, seeking God's will and praying according to his word and scripture. That's where we were with my dad. We told the doctors, "We don't believe you." Our father had entered the hospital pushing a walker. He's going to walk out of here carrying that walker over his head, we said. In prayer, God revealed to us that there was a medication that was keeping our dad in what seemed like a medically induced lobotomized state. Over and over, we pleaded with the doctors to take him off of it. Finally, we asked for just a chance. Take him off for a week, we said. All right, one physician said. You've got 7 days. 7 days later, Dad woke up. He literally just came to, suddenly himself again. A few days later, he walked out of the hospital carrying his walker over his head. 3 weeks later, I played him in a pool and he beat me. I played him in pool and he beat me. Utterly and completely healed, Dad has never looked back. Maybe that kind of attitude is in my genes. Everything I tried in my life, I dove into it with a passion. If something happened where I had to change course, it would often knock me for a loop. But I look back now and realize those things had to happen. I wasn't just an addict, I was an addict and an entrepreneur. I was an addict and a child of God. My life was just like any other, full of rituals. Crack cocaine took everything: my marriage, my relationship with my kids, Schmitty's, and my company. But each time I fell, by God's grace, I got back up again. Now, standing on the Vine Center stage at Liberty University, I looked out at the crowd and remembered the premonition I'd had at that home show in Des Moines, where I'd seen thousands of empty seats in that arena and realized that someday I'd have to face my worst fear. Not only had God now brought that to fruition, but he had also taken away my fear. There is no feeling like the knowledge that you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what God would have you do. And that is what I felt that day at Liberty. As I wrapped up my convocation speech, I emphasized that each person in that audience also had a calling and that they should never give up their quest to fulfill it. When I took my seat at stage left, it hit me again. the awesome and unimaginable plans as God has for each of us. Honestly, I don't know where this ends. Just when I think God can't bless me anymore, He does. Sitting there on that wildly unlikely platform, I ask my favorite question: what are the odds? What are the odds that an ex crack addict, drinker, and gambling addict would be invited to address this group of young people? One in a million? One in a billion? Impossible? Let's call it what it is: a miracle to be continued. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your paths. Proverbs 3:5-6. This concludes the reading of What Are the Odds by Mike Lindell, From Crack Addict to CEO. Digital Hawk holds and owns no copyrights to the reading and presentation of this material is for educational purposes only.